Hello and welcome. I'm your instructor, Chris Wade. I'm a professor in the School of Nursing and Health Studies. And this class is going to be about communication and the various different types of health crises that we're facing as a society. So first off, I just want to welcome you all to this class. I know that this is a strange time for us, and I'm really excited to talk about these ideas with you right now, especially because we've all been going through this together. So I'm excited to do this. We'll have lots of time to chat about all these things in the coming months. So I'll just start by saying a little bit about why I'm teaching this course. I've taught on health communication quite a bit over the years as parts of other courses. I've also, in my own field, done a fair bit of research on health communication in different types of forms. And some of my more recent work looking at some climate change issues really is focusing on communication to some extent. I think that this class really came to mind in part as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, is trying to process and think a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic that we're facing right now. This has been a strange couple of years, a very difficult time, and a lot of people have died. We're at over 800,000 people who've died in the United States and millions who've died internationally. So, this keeps on going on, and I think that it takes a toll. Just yesterday we hit the peak number that we've ever had in the United States for cases per day. So we hit 1 million cases in a single day yesterday, Monday. So these are all challenging experiences, and many of us have lost people who we care about in our lives. I know I've lost several, and as somebody who does public health and who cares about these topics a lot, it's been a real challenge to see how this pandemic has evolved. And if you're like me, watching the conversation, I know we all probably have different opinions, but the way that the conversation has evolved and communication has evolved around this very serious social challenge and health challenge has been disappointing. We've had many examples of failed communication along that as that has occurred. So I think that probably most of us are trying to think a little bit about what does that mean? How could we do better in the future? And where did we go wrong in some ways? I also have been doing a lot of work, as I mentioned, in the area of climate change, which is another real significant crisis for our society, where, again, we have a lot of challenges when it comes to communication. There's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of misinformation, and we are really struggling as a society, as a community, to engage with this in a way that can help us move forward. So I've been actually studying this a fair bit, and I'm going to be using, actually in this course, actually a fair number of examples from both COVID-19 and my climate change work. That said, this course is really relevant to health issues in general, any sort of health crisis. And there are many of them, the opioid epidemic, there's other types of infectious disease, there's social justice challenges that we're struggling with as a society. There's many different types of things that we could apply these lenses and these strategies to improve our ability to communicate around real serious health situations. So when we're thinking about these health situations, we should probably start with some understanding of how communication is going to interact with them, right? So first off, what is communication? Well, communication is really talking about how people use messages to convey meaning to one another. And that could be to other individuals or other groups. And it could be in different types of contexts, using different types of media. And we know that there are lots of different ways that culture interacts with this communication. So there's a lot of complexity within this idea. And we'll talk about that a fair bit more as we go forward. Now, what is health communication? So health communication is kind of two things. One way you could talk about health communication is as an activity. That's something that we do. So health communication in that context is, according to Society for Health Communication, the science and art of using communication to advance health and well-being of people and populations. So pretty straightforward in that sense. And that's what we're doing when we're communicating about health. You could also think about health communication as being a field of study, or something that people do as a profession, right? And in this context, it's a field of study that applies communication, scientific evidence, different types of strategies and theories, and our own creativity and imagination to promote health behaviors or policies or actions and practices that improve the health and well-being of people, right? So that's what the field of health communication is trying to do. Now, health communication itself is actually a relatively new field. It's actually, we've been doing health communication for eons in various different ways. You can go back to the Bible and find instances of health being talked about in various different ways. As a field of study, it really came into its own really only 30 years or so ago. So it's a relatively new field. And part of the reason that this is the case is, in some ways, health communication hasn't been taken as seriously as it should as an independent area of study, and something that we can really improve in a systematic way. Part of this is because there's a mistake that's often made in health and health practice, where we think about people and the people that we're interacting and talking with and to about health as being people who sort of have this linear way of thinking. So an example of this is we say, here's a health problem and here's the data, and someone gets that information and their brain acts like a computer or a machine where they say, all right, well, this is a higher risk. This seems like a bad thing. Based upon this, I'm just going to do this thing because it's the best thing to do. And then they'll take the information that you shared, the risk information you shared, and they'll just do it. And surprise, surprise, that actually isn't how brains work. That's not how people talk. That's not how people think. And when public health officials or other health professionals try and talk in that way about health, very often it's not very effective. And sometimes we can even undermine our own efforts to improve health for the public. What we know now, and we'll talk about this more later, is that health, that the way people think about health is actually substantially more complex. And the way people think in general about risk or any type of information is much, much more complex. You can think about it as being this much more vibrant, organic process where we integrate our emotions, our past history and experience, our own understanding of what different things mean, which vary substantially across cultures. And when someone says something to us about health, we apply all those different things to our understanding of what's being said. And in fact, some of these things are really not even within our own brains. A lot of it has to do with the context that we're in, our cultures, the setting that we're in, and how other people are thinking that we care about, right? So if we're really going to understand the way that communication occurs, we have to have a fairly complex understanding of communication, the processes by which people understand information, the ways in which we can communicate better, and sort of the ways in which this can be optimized using research to make that communication as effective as possible. So, that's sort of a theoretical idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about health communication, right? But, it's helpful to have some sort of examples of what this can look like. Well, health communication occurs all the time in our everyday life. When you're talking to your family about, you have some health issue and you talk to your parent maybe, or a sibling, that's health communications. When you talk to your friends, this type of thing comes up in conversation all the time. That's health communication, right? You can also have public communications about health, for example, posters or public service announcements, or officials who are saying something about public health, making recommendations to a community. That'd be another example. Health communication is also what you can find on the web. So if you have a health issue and you go and look something up to understand it better, that's a health communication form of health communication. We also, on an individual level, engage with our clinicians around thinking about our health, right? So we have that on an individual basis. Then we have music or arts or all sorts of different types of ways in which health is talked about in that context, or TV or news. We get a lot of health information there. Then we have it in our community. So within communities, we have different ideas in our culture or in the people that we work together with to do this. And very often we're working together to work on an issue that we're facing together, right? And then we have different types of entertainment. So, when you have people who do something in a TV show that puts them at greater risk and they suffer as a result, well, that's a type of communication. Or if they do it right and they succeed, well, that's also a type of communication around health. And then there's all the different ways that we're talking online and through different types of media to understand this. So different types of discussion on the web that you might be involved in to understand your own health or what's going on around you in terms of the various different health crises that we're facing. So speaking of health crises, what is a health crisis? Well, to be honest, the term is used a little bit broadly, right? So any sort of if someone can argue that a health issue is serious, very often they'll use the term health crisis. But generally speaking, what we're talking about here is a serious health situation that has an impact on human health, right? And usually you expect that there are some consequences that are pretty major, and that could be someone could be injured, as in a disaster or something like that. It could be that something where somebody has a disease or their health is impaired in some way, even if it's not fatal, right? And then there's other situations, the health crisis, where people are dying as a result of whatever that situation is, right? And sometimes these crises are local. So you could have a crisis here in Seattle, for example, or it could be a national crisis, or it could be an international crisis, right? And these crises can have many different sources. So they could be something that is due to a human action. For example, terrorism can be a health crisis, or it could be something that's caused by the natural environment, right? So there's many different sources for this, but that's what we're generally talking about when we're talking about a health crisis. Now, why is this class focusing on crisis and communication? Well, health crises have a specific type of they relate to general health communication, but they have more serious and specific types of things that we want to talk about. So in this class, we're going to be discussing disasters and other types of serious situations. Sometimes they have a time element to them, which make them more serious about where the progression of them, right? So, for example, in Hurricane Katrina, there was really awful health communication and preparatory communication about this severe risk. And as a result, many people died. Many people were hurt. People's lives were dramatically shifted. And we know that there was huge disparity in terms of who got talked to and who got the benefits and access to this health information and who did not. And that's largely because we weren't prepared to do this well. We did not succeed at implementing that from a health perspective or from a public communication perspective. And it was actually a fairly massive failure for our community. And we often come back to that case example. And many of you are familiar with that and the many other situations that are going on now, from COVID-19 to climate change to you know, any of a range of different types of challenges that we're facing, right? So when we have those serious situations, people's psychology is different. There's a need to be very efficient. You have to have a really good plan, and you have to have processes in place to really support people as they're going through this crisis. All right, so that's a bit about what this class is about. But I want to tell you in a little bit more detail what we're going to be actually studying as we go forward with this term. So this week is really just starting out and thinking about some of those general issues, getting to know each other a little bit. Next week, we're going to start talking a little bit more about health crises. So first off, getting a little bit more understanding of, first off, what is health? How does it work? What are some of the major health challenges that we're facing? What do we think about a crisis? How do we think about emergency preparedness, for example? And we're also going to talk a little bit about some basic information about the two main examples I'll be using in this course, which is COVID-19 and climate change. So that's going to be our first week, just to get ourselves familiarized with some of these health-related issues that we'll be looking at as we go forward. In the next week, we're going to be talking a little bit about health literacy and communications research. So when it comes to understanding health and communicating with others, we really need to, first off, understand a little bit about how communication occurs, right? And what the processes are within them, how communication is structured, and how people would understand that, right? So health literacy, again, now would be how good are people at actually understanding information that's conveyed around health, be it either written information, spoken information, or numbers. These are things that vary substantially across communities. And if we're trying to communicate about health, we have to be really aware of that, because if we're speaking about things in a certain way that's very technical and people don't understand it, we're not actually accomplishing anything. And in fact, we could be harming people, right? So we have to pay a lot of attention to that and to making sure that we meet people where they are. We're also going to talk a little bit about the role of research in improving health communication. So research gives us the opportunity to understand a situation and understand how that we can actually communicate better. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the methods that are used there to understand these issues. In week 4, we're going to talk a little bit about health psychology and behavior. And here we're really talking about health psychology and behavior as it relates to us being able to talk to people. So we'll talk a little bit about how people think about health, how they think about risk, how they make decisions about whether or not to engage with a health behavior or not, what people see as being barriers to helping them actually improve their health, right, and engage with the behavior. We'll also talk a little bit about different people's biases. We know that how people understand what you're saying to them is influenced by where they're coming from. And, these biases are sometimes sort of inherently human, and sometimes they are related to our background and where we're coming from. So it can be really helpful to begin to understand some of these ideas, and also how we can begin to work with communicating in a way that can address some of the challenges and misinformation that people are encountering when it comes to health crises. So in week 5, we're going to talk about some approaches to communicating effectively. So there are strategies for being more effective, right? So there's a bunch of different things like stories, right? So people love stories. When you talk about things and you describe something, it really helps them engage with it. There's other things like framing. How do you describe things? Do you describe things as an economic issue? Do you describe it as a health issue? Do you describe it as a community issue? Do you describe it as something that you do to support your family, right? How you describe a health challenge is going to influence how people hear it. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of those strategies for actually communicating better with people and making your communication more impactful and beneficial to everybody. In week 6, we're going to move on to talk a little bit about planning communications. So we've gotten some background on how you communicate well. Now here, what we're going to try and do is start applying methods to developing an actual message to convey to people. And we're fortunate that in public health, we actually have a lot of different methods that we've developed over time for actually structuring our communications to plan for a crisis before it occurs, to engage with that community and through communications while it's occurring, and also communicate with people and following up on that crisis. These planning strategies have shown to be very effective, and they'll help us to sort of think about strategically about how to better engage with people. In week 7, we're going to talk a little bit about communication channels. So how do we actually convey information to people? There's different ways of doing it. You could talk to people, you could on an individual level or in a group level through public service announcements. You can use the arts, you could use writing, you could use the internet. There's all sorts of different ways that you can engage with people, and it helps to understand a little bit about how the media works, how the news works, for example, and how we communicate with each other, especially on social media, which is a major way that people get their health-related news nowadays. In week 8, we're going to talk a little bit about community partnerships and advocacy. So the idea here is that when we're dealing with communicating about health issues, that's affecting real people that are out in our community. And there's a lot of different organizations and groups within the community who are really engaged in making these communications work with people. It's very often the case that it's actually these community partnerships and relationships between people who are working in health and people who are in communities that actually effectively lead to change and effective communication. And it's only by actually really engaging well with community partners that we'll succeed at communicating well. We can also think about this in terms of how do we advocate for health issues. So what are some strategies that we can use to talk more effectively when we're promoting a specific set of solutions or recommendations around a health-related crisis? So we'll be working on that for a little bit. In week 9, it's a week that's I'm currently leaving open because things might come up during the class that we decide that we want to explore a little bit further. So we'll pull that one out of the hat when it's time for it to occur. But I'm looking forward to figuring that one out. Week 10 will be presentations where you're going to talk a little bit about a health crisis that you are interested in and some of the communication issues related to that. And then we'll close up with a summary and thinking a little bit about future directions that we could think about for health communication as we go forward. And then finals week, there's a little bit of finishing up, but that will be mostly it. Well, that's about it for just understanding what we're doing in this course. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to get to know you all. I think that it's a fascinating topic. It's a very challenging topic that we're still learning about. As I said before, health communication is a newer field. There's a lot to be gained by beginning to look at some of the different strategies that are evolving. And there's, of course, a lot of opportunities for you to take these ideas and move forward with it in your own career to help improve health for yourselves, your families, and your community. So looking forward to our conversations, and take care and be well.